Welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen. We're just thrilled you're all here. It's wonderful to be together again, and what we hope is the first of many, many renewed live events here at Independent. I'm Mary Thoreau. I'm Chairman and CEO of Independent Institute. My late husband, David Thoreau, founded Independent 38 years ago in order to undertake rigorous but nonpartisan analyses of the policy drivers of many issues of current concern, and most importantly, to advance alternative enterprising solutions to those. Our research areas cover a really wide range of issues, anything from foreign policy to healthcare, inflation, education, the economy, homelessness, and lots more. We disseminate our studies as books, articles, op-eds, commentary, through events and conferences, and across a variety of transmedia channels, including podcasts and produced videos. We're 100% privately supported by contributions from individuals and foundations, and we welcome you to join us in partnering in our mission to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. We have an exciting evening tonight. We're delighted to have some of the Nozick family with us. I was saying I can't believe it's been 50 years because I'm pretty sure I read this book really soon after it came out, and was very impressed by it, and it was foundational in forming my thinking. I've always been very interested in these ideas and appreciate people who can put them so well. It's my pleasure now to introduce our president, Graham Walker, who will kick us off.
I'm Graham Walker, happy to welcome you, along with Mary and others, to Independent Institute this evening. In the 1970s, the world, or at least the policy and cultural world, was enamored with John Rawls and his moral rationale that seemed to meet the need of the moment, or should I say the felt need of the moment in the mid-70s, which was to justify an interventionist government that actively redistributed income in the service of equality. But interestingly, at almost the same cultural moment, another voice, also emanating from Harvard's philosophy department, offered an important dissent from the Rawlsian social democratic consensus. Robert Nozick, with his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, published 50 years ago in 1974. Nozick was like an infusion of oxygen for those gasping for air in the Rawlsian consensus, which at the time seemed to brook no dissent. Of course, there's more to Robert Nozick, the philosopher, than this one book. But this book was such an analytical and cultural landmark that we at the Independent Review, the quarterly journal of Independent Institute, chose to honor him and the book with a special issue devoted to it, which you have a copy of on your seat. Some of you may have gotten it in the mail recently. Nozick's book and our scholars' assessment of it forms the subject of our gathering tonight. Again, of course, there was more to Robert Nozick, the man, than his philosophical work. That's why we are very pleased to welcome someone who knew him very well indeed, his daughter, Emily Nozick. Emily Nozick is an attorney here in Northern California, an accomplished professional and high-caliber thinker in her own right. To begin our evening, please join me in welcoming Emily Nozick, who has graciously agreed to offer some pertinent reminiscences of the man and the thinker, Robert Nozick. Welcome, Emily. Family members with you as well. You want to introduce them?
I do. I'm here with my partner, Barry, and my younger daughter, Sarah. Unfortunately, my older daughter could not be here today. My brother also wanted to come and couldn't be here. And my mother was going to come, but she got sick at the last minute, and so she was not able to be here either. But everyone is thrilled that this event is going on, so thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be included in this event honoring the 50th anniversary of my father's book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's extremely difficult to know where to begin in paying tribute to my father. He lived his life fully, energetically, and with intense joy. One of my favorite things about my dad was just talking to him and getting his perspective. He was a great talker and loved listening and discussing anything, from politics to movies, feminism to The Sopranos. My father was not one of those smart people who just like to hear themselves talk. Some naturally charismatic people seem to suck energy away from others, to overshadow people with their personality or dominate with their intelligence. Not my dad. It was actually the opposite. His inclusive energy fed those around him. He loved the give and take. He really listened. He was truly engaged. He challenged people and encouraged the best in them. We all burned a little bit brighter when talking to him. I remember one night when I was 12 years old and couldn't sleep. I went down to my dad's office and found him on the couch surrounded by yellow pads. In those days, he always wrote longhand on yellow legal pads. I asked him what he was working on, and he explained that he was writing a chapter on why there was something rather than nothing. We got into a whole discussion about it. At some point during that conversation, I questioned why nothing was assumed to be the natural state. Since we know there is something, and something couldn't come from nothing, then maybe something was the natural state. This made it into his book, Philosophical Explanations, and he credited me, age 12, with the idea, which thrilled me to no end and was so generously him. My father had a profound curiosity about the world. He loved teaching, and he really loved learning. So many professors teach the same class over and over again. My dad never repeated a class. Actually, he almost never repeated a class. I believe the only class he taught more than once was called Thinking About Thinking, which he taught with Alan Dershowitz and Stephen Jay Gould because the demand was so great. He taught classes in what he was interested in or wanted to learn more about. He was intensely curious about so many different areas: epistemology, ontology, decision theory, moral philosophy, science, Eastern mysticism, and many others. And he didn't just teach about philosophy. He would stand in front of his class and do philosophy, allowing his students to experience with him the dynamic, living, breathing process of asking questions rather than only analyzing other people's work. Although he is still best known for the political philosophy book that we're honoring tonight, he wrote it when he was in his early 30s and didn't choose to marinate in it or coast off of it. He didn't want to spend his career writing Son of Anarchy State in Utopia or Bride of Anarchy State in Utopia. He certainly did not think of himself as exclusively a political philosopher. Philosophy was so much a part of who he was that he once told me he would do it even if he were not paid a dime. That forever became the measure for me of passion for one's work. He thought about what is meaningful in life, and he lived accordingly. Outside of philosophy, he loved art, music, poetry, detective novels, sports, travel. But lest you think he was skilled at everything, he was not. He loved singing, although he could not carry a tune. He was an enthusiastic dancer, but had 2 left feet. And he was surprisingly terrible at learning foreign languages. Even when we lived in Israel for a year, he didn't pick up the language at all. After that year, he would frequently joke his parents spoke in Yiddish so he wouldn't understand, and his children spoke in Hebrew so he wouldn't understand. He was a great dad, both when I was a child and as an adult. He was always extremely playful, even goofy, like a big kid himself. He read to us nightly from such disparate books as King Lear, The Narnia Chronicles, Watership Down. He bought my brother and me baseball mitts, and we would toss the ball around in the backyard. He loved card games and taking us to Red Sox and Celtics games. He bought me a book of logic puzzles called What is the Name of This Book?, which I absolutely loved. And then I handed down the dog-eared copy to my daughter, Rachel, and she ended up writing her college essay about her love of logic games. So on it goes. He supported me when I chose to study philosophy and also supported me when I chose not to pursue it beyond college. He showered love and attention on his granddaughters during the all too brief time that they had with him. My dad died in January of 2002. I remember being selfishly grateful that he died after September 11th, so at least I could process that terrible, disorienting event with him, because nobody else had his unique perspective. There have been countless times over the nearly 23 years since his death that I've wished I could talk to him about the radical changes in my own life, or increasingly, and to this very day, about this crazy and confusing world we find ourselves in. But the flip side of the blessing of my father is that it is impossible to predict what he would have said. He could not be pigeonholed. He could not be categorized. He was a nuanced, out-of-the-box thinker, and his views were always evolving. And so we are left to wonder, but also to appreciate and marvel at how lucky we were to have known him and to have benefited from his unique, insightful mind, his vivid, generous spirit, and his joyful, ever-youthful heart. Thank you.
We have some people who have been studying his work very carefully. One thing I invite you to do is that if you pick up the copy of the Independent Review and look at the table of contents. Now, you may show us a little bit more about this in a minute, but if you look at the table of contents, you'll see the essays about Nozick and his book on the table of contents page. We have two of the authors of essays in that section today. We have, first of all, Greg Robson, and then Christopher Freiman. Let me tell you about Greg Robson first, and he'll speak first. Greg Robson is a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute. He is associate research professor in the Mendoza School of Business at the University of Notre Dame, and he's a co-editor of this journal, the Independent Review. In fact, he was the one who was the quarterback and organizer of all the essays and writers in this collection. He's the editor of the forthcoming book, Technology Ethics. That's a good one. And a contributing author to the book, Exploring the Political Economy and Social Philosophy of F.A. Hayek. His articles and reviews have been published in such journals as Ethics, Journal of Moral Philosophy, Politics, Philosophy and Economics, Journal of Business Ethics, Public Affairs Quarterly, and so forth. So please welcome Dr. Gregory Robson, who will be giving us some initial remarks about this special issue of the Independent Review.
First, I'd like to extend my appreciation to the Independent Institute for hosting this event. It's a very special event. Thank you to Graham Walker and Mary Thoreau and everyone involved for putting this event together. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well, and to all of you for being here, for attending. According to the famous sociologist Max Weber, the state is that entity which claims a legitimate territorial monopoly on the use of force. It says, around here, we get to make the laws, we get to enforce the laws. If you break the laws, if you're a non-complier, we can put you in prison or we can fine you. The modern nation state is something that virtually every person in the world today, virtually all 8 billion people, not all, there's a significant exception, but virtually all find themselves in. Nearly all people today live in states. David Hume and our founding editor of the Independent Review, Bob Higgs, talked about very eloquently how the state uses conquest and confiscation. It uses wars and taxation. This is something that's not a left or right observation. This is an observation that anyone paying attention to what states do will notice. Robert Nozick in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, ASU, wanted to know how the state can emerge in a morally justified way, if it can. He was writing when John Rawls had just revived political philosophy. I often say, thanks to Rawls, there's a field called political philosophy that I'm fortunate to work in now. He revived the field. At the time, people thought that value judgments, people in philosophy, value judgments about moral and political philosophy were out. There's a question, how can we reconcile those value judgments with a naturalistic view of the universe? People thought that discussion of God was out in so-called analytic philosophy in the mid to late 20th century. More on that in my second talk in this event. There was also the thought that political philosophy can't be done with systematicity and rigor. Rawls showed that it indeed could. Now, I think there are some substantial problems with Rawls's political philosophy, and one of the panelists, Chris Freiman, with us today, has written an important book indicating some concerns and showing a positive way forward in terms of how to do political philosophy. Now, Nozick's writing itself was a response to Rawls, but it was much, much more than that. His writing and argumentation, for one thing, are very different from Rawls's. I think they're far more stylistically engaging and certainly no less logically powerful. In this talk, I want to describe the contribution of ASU itself, the reason why the Independent Review devoted a special issue to it, and then talk about the articles a bit from the symposium issue. Now, some core themes in Anarchy, State, and Utopia include the existence of strong private property rights, the limits these impose on political actors, including states, and the value to society of having a diverse group of people who can choose to lead lives of their own, as long as they associate with others freely and respect others without harming them, and vice versa. Nozick opens ASU with the powerful line, "Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights." He then asks, how much room do individual rights leave for the state? The first challenge of ASU then is to show why, as Nozick thinks, the emergence of the state can be morally justified in conditions of anarchy. So you have a so-called state of nature where there are no states. Humanity has lasted maybe 200 to 300,000 years. At some point in history, there were no states. The state then emerges. Eventually, fast forward a whole lot, you get to the modern system of nation states around 1648 after the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia. Nozick asks, well, how does this state emerge? And can it emerge in a way that is morally justified? If states typically emerge through conquest and confiscation, as Hume wrote in his brilliant essay of the original contract, is it possible, at least in principle, for states to emerge in morally permissible ways? Okay, so suppose again that the state is an entity that claims a legitimate territorial monopoly on the use of violence. It says around here, we, the state, get the police power, we get the military power, we make, interpret, and enforce the laws. And we, an unspecified we, by the way, always ask who is the we exactly, we have authority. The question is, how did we get this authority? Prompted by Murray Rothbard to reconsider the moral justification of the state, Nozick says that people in anarchic society would pay protective agencies to secure their interests. Eventually, a dominant protective agency would emerge and compensate those who incur costs from its emergence. This agency, the dominant agency, Nozick says, would have a right to protect its clients from unreliable adjudicatory procedures. One way it would do so is to require those who are engaged with its clients to submit to their own procedures and then compensate them for any loss that they incur from submitting to those procedures. If the compensation is adequate, then the dominant agency would become a legitimate minimal state by a series of morally permitted steps. So there's this big puzzle. You've got this state that has the power of violence. How does it emerge? And Nozick says, through a series of morally permissible steps, we can sketch it out. Nozick's work is a major advance in our understanding of the just state, but also of our understanding of distributive justice. Rawlsians and others at the time, Rawls wrote A Theory of Justice in 1971, they took time-slice views of market outcomes. Many still do today. The question then is, how big a slice of the economic pie does justice require people to get? If there are major wealth inequalities, as indeed there are, these are usually taken to be at least prima facie unjust. But consider Nozick's famous discussion of Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball legend who once scored 100 points in a single game and averaged 50 points and 25 rebounds for an entire season. Now, I grew up in suburban Chicago, so I think Jordan probably was the GOAT, by the way, but there's a case to be made for Chamberlain. Okay, there really is. In Nozick's scenario, Chamberlain makes great sums of money. People go to see the game, they pay the money, Chamberlain gets a cut of the revenues, he makes a lot of money, there's a resultant inequality, an economic inequality, but all of this happens through voluntary transactions by actors presumed to be rational and well-informed. Nozick says, to all appearances, the distributive process itself is just. notwithstanding any wealth inequalities it yields, and regardless of Chamberlain's success, owing partly to natural luck in his physical stature and athleticism, just partly. Nozick's crucial idea is that whatever property outcomes are based on just acquisition and transfer are themselves just if rectification for past injustices is provided. I'll discuss this in my next talk. Let me mention one more part of Nozick's argumentation, partly to indicate just why the Independent Review was so keen to celebrate it. Then I'll say a bit about the essays themselves. So Nozick had a lot to say about I suppose the dangers of a priori theorizing. He wasn't against it altogether. Indeed, he himself was an a priori theorist, and all of us in philosophy are to some extent, I would say. But he worried about that, and he has this to say in his inimitable style. It's helpful to imagine cavemen sitting together to think up what for all time will be the best possible society, and then setting out to institute it. So cavemen are sitting there thinking, what's going to be the best possible society? Maybe 200,000 years ago they're thinking this, let's say. Do none of the reasons that make you smile at this apply to us? And the thought is that human societies are so immensely complex that it seems impossible, almost in principle, to come up with a theory of justice that would apply to all societies for all time, indicating what the best society would be like and what it would be like for justice to obtain in that society. All right, let me say a bit about the essays themselves now in our semi-centennial volume on Anarchy, State, and Utopia. We are fortunate, as Dr. Walker mentioned, to have many important contributors and keen analysts of Nozick's thought. In an essay titled My Dinner with Nozick, David Schmitz begins by observing, while no one comes close to Rawls in terms of citations or influence, no one comes closer than Nozick. Schmitz details the humanity of Nozick the person, alerting the reader to Nozick's personal warmth and rare combination of ingenuity, curiosity, and openness to learning. In breaking bread with Nozick, Schmitz discovered a kinship with a conversation partner whose philosophical prowess was eclipsed only by his desire to learn. Interestingly, you can trace a line of thought, by the way, from Nozick to many people, including Schmitz. Schmitz, who wrote a book on Nozick, and to Schmitz's many students, including myself, Professor Freiman, Professor Jason Brennan at Georgetown, and others. Robert Nozick was creating really a cottage industry of scholars who take his work very seriously and hope to carry the torch forward. In the next essay, Robert Nozick and the Moral High Ground, Jason Brennan discusses Nozick's argumentative strategy in ASU. Nozick doesn't start by making concessions. Many philosophers will start by making concessions, ceding a lot of ground. Rather, Nozick demonstrates the untoward outcomes of taking opponents' arguments to their logical conclusions. Next, we have an essay from Jessica Flanagan and Professor Freiman, and I'll let him discuss his subtle essay. Afterwards, Aon Scoble has an essay that examines the pluralism of human nature and the significance of it for political philosophy. Then we get an essay from Richard Salzman of Duke University, who investigates Nozick's shift from seeing taxation, and this is a really remarkable shift, by the way, from seeing taxation as tantamount to forced labor. The idea being that if we're taxed, we're forced to give some of the money that the revenue, say, we've generated to others, and that's a condition of working. Nozick shifted from that to adopting more of a Rawlsian approach, arguably, that's favorable to inheritance taxes, according to Salzman. In New Problems in Nozick's Derivation of the Minimal State, the important intellectual historian and philosopher David Gordon makes what I think is a very interesting argument. The thrust of it really is that he says, it's not clear that having a minimal state is better than not having a minimal state or not having any state whatsoever. In fact, arguments can be made according to which a minimal state wouldn't arise by a series of permissible steps, permissible by the lights of justice. For example, you might have a system where you have a society with a bunch of different states, all small states or mid-sized states, reaching a sort of equilibrium without a dominant protective agency arising. Finally, Eric Mack, a philosopher at Tulane University who wrote, by the way, the Stanford Encyclopedia article on Nozick's political philosophy, explores Nozick's idea of the separateness of persons. Our distinctness as individuals has weighty implications, he argues, for our understanding of interpersonal interaction and association. We, and I'll talk about this more in my next presentation, we, each one of us, we're separate persons. We're unique. We have individual lives that are radically complex, and we have a special dignity. And I think you can see in Nozick's work a recognition of that fact. So that's what I have to say by way of an overview of Nozick's contribution in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and the contributions of our authors in this appreciative volume. Thank you for your attention.
We'll hear a bit more from Dr. Robson when we invite him back up to actually give us a summary of his own particular chapter contribution in this issue of the Independent Review. But now, let me introduce to you Christopher Freiman. Chris Freiman is professor in the John Chambers College of Business and Economics at West Virginia University. He is author of The Unequivocal Justice and Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. That sounds good. As well as numerous articles and book chapters, his work has appeared in the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, and the Oxford Handbook of Political Philosophy. So please tell us something about this strange chapter, Chris Freiman, putting Wilt Chamberlain back in the game, why liberalism is not compatible with distributive egalitarianism.
Thank you. So, Greg, I really appreciated your introduction. I agree with everything you said except for your absurd claim that Michael Jordan is better than Wilt Chamberlain. That's just...
We have much to discuss.
We have a lot to discuss. I'm only half joking when I say I think one of Nozick's more underrated accomplishments is keeping the name of Wilt Chamberlain alive, because my students, they're all like Jordan, LeBron, and Curry, yeah, and I teach them the Wilt Chamberlain argument, and so I get to have a digression about why Wilt Chamberlain is actually the greatest of all time. It's not even close, frankly, but I could do my whole 15 minutes on Wilt Chamberlain. I'll try to resist the urge. But thank you all so much for coming here. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. I think Nozick provides a model of how to do philosophy and how to live as a philosopher, how to live a life with courage and integrity. And simply put, he's a hero of mine. So it really is an honor to speak here tonight. And I want to talk a bit about the paper that Jessica Flanagan, she's a philosopher at the University of Richmond, the paper that Jess and I wrote as part of the volume. We argue that many of Nozick's critics seem to misunderstand one of his most famous arguments, the so-called Wilt Chamberlain argument, or at the very least, there's a plausible reading of this argument that evades all of their objections. So the Wilt Chamberlain argument targets what Nozick calls patterned principles of distributive justice, in particular egalitarian patterned principles. So very simply put, I'm sort of running roughshod over a lot of subtlety here, but according to a patterned principle of justice, the distributive justice of a society depends on the extent to which distributions of resources, status, opportunities, other sorts of goods, and so on, approximate an egalitarian state of affairs. So one way of thinking about this is, I don't know, you'll see politicians, like this is maybe like a Bernie Sanders sort of thing, where there'll be like a pie chart. They'll say, 2% of the country controls 31%, I don't know, 31% of the wealth or something like that. And the idea is that we're supposed to conclude simply from how the pieces of the pie are divided, there's some sort of injustice. We just have to look at how the pie is sliced. Nozick says, no, this is too quick. You have to look at how people came to get their slice of the pie. So in sort of analytic political philosophy, one of the most famous, maybe the most famous pattern principle of justice, and the one that Nozick spends the most time talking about, is Rawls's difference principle. This essentially says that a distribution is just if it maximizes the material welfare of the poorest people in society. So maybe if the distribution of income makes the income of the poorest as high as possible. You can imagine other pattern principles, though. So the simplest one would be strict equality. So there aren't a ton of advocates for this, but the idea here would be distribution is just if everybody has exactly the same. Nobody has any more, nobody has any less. So on our reading of Nozick, what he is trying to do with this argument is different than what his critics think he's trying to do. We argue that he's showing that a patterned approach to distributive justice is inconsistent with basic liberal commitments. And so I didn't say libertarian commitments, and I think that's important. So Nozick's argument, according to our interpretation, purports to show that robust protection of basic liberties, in particular rights of personal property and occupational choice, is incompatible with any sort of patterned principle of distributive justice. So let me unpack this a little bit. So non-libertarian liberals like John Rawls, and so when I say liberal, it's like sort of confusing because now people use liberal to mean all sorts of things. When I say liberal, I don't mean, members of the Democratic Party or the Green Party or anything like that. It's not supposed to be synonymous with progressive. It's a sort of political philosophy that assigns liberty the highest value. And you don't have to be a libertarian to believe that. So Rawls believed that. He wasn't a libertarian. But the basic idea is you imagine key civil liberties, things like freedom of speech, freedom of religious practice, freedom of association. These things take priority over other political considerations. And their protection isn't subject to a cost-benefit analysis. So even if you have some sort of efficiency expert tell you that, well, censoring free speech would actually be beneficial for society on net, it would accelerate economic growth, something like that. You might say, okay, fine, but you still can't censor speech because that would violate people's rights to freedom of speech. So that's basically what I mean when I am calling someone a liberal in this paper. So, like I said, freedom of expression, freedom of religious practice, but even non-libertarian liberals like Rawls think that you have a basic liberty to personal property and that you have the right to choose your own occupation. And just to see why these rights would get included on the list of basic liberties, you could just think of it this way. It seems pretty clearly authoritarian for a state to tell you what you can and can't do with your house, like buying and selling your house or a car, a computer, what books you can buy and sell, what food you can buy and eat, that sort of thing. Or if the state told you you can't choose how you're going to spend your 80,000 hours or so on the clock. It seems like these are basic liberties that people should have. And so our argument is that what Nozick is purporting to show is that there is a tension between being a liberal, an umbrella that includes people like John Rawls, and being an egalitarian about economics. And to illustrate, Nozick gives us the Wilt Chamberlain argument. So he says, look, imagine we have a society that's achieved the perfect pattern. And it doesn't matter what that pattern is. Like, pick your favorite. So if you're a Rawlsian, imagine that we've achieved Rawlsian distributive justice. For my sake, just for the sake of simplicity, we'll just go with the easiest principle, which is pure equality. So you say, maybe society has achieved a perfectly equal distribution of resources. Now imagine that this basketball player, the greatest basketball player of all time, arguably the greatest athlete of all time, it's, Wilt Chamberlain, he comes to town. Not only did he average 50 points that year, the regulation time of an NBA game is 48 minutes. Yeah. He averaged 48.3 minutes played that year. It's incredible. He's an Iron Man. So Wilt Chamberlain comes, I'm from the Philadelphia area, so I might have a bias. So Wilt Chamberlain comes to town and he says, look, I'm going to offer the people here an opportunity. If you're a fan of mine, you can see me play, but 25 cents from every ticket to the game goes to me. Chamberlain sells, say, 1 million tickets. This makes him substantially richer than everyone else. And this result, of course, disrupts the egalitarian pattern. We no longer have equality. Right. Now, if distributive justice requires achieving an egalitarian pattern, and again, you can use whatever pattern you want, then the new distribution has to be unjust. Why? Well, it no longer fits the pattern. On the other hand, if justice requires protecting people's personal property rights, their rights of occupational choice, then the new distribution is just, because it arises through an exercise of those rights. And so then you might ask yourself, which is it? Is it just or is it unjust? We argued that it's just. the post-Chamberlain distribution. And in defense of this view, just consider the following. Like, look at each party to the new distribution. So you have the fans who chose to pay Wilt Chamberlain. They wanted to watch him play. They were simply exercising their right of personal property when they decided to use some of their income on tickets. It's their money. They say, all right, I want to give it to Chamberlain to watch him play. Fair enough. Those who didn't want to watch Chamberlain play, they didn't give any money to Chamberlain, that's fine. They were also exercising their personal property rights. So they said, I'd rather keep my income or, I don't know, spend it on Taylor Swift tickets, something like that. Like that's just their, they get to choose how they use their income. And then lastly, you have Chamberlain. Chamberlain was simply exercising his right of occupational choice when he decided to occupy himself playing basketball in exchange for a quarter per ticket. So the Wilt Chamberlain argument shows that public officials can't respect the free exercise of people's basic rights while also maintaining an egalitarian pattern. There's a real conflict here. So part of what we try to do in the paper is show that this reading of what Nozick is doing in the Wilt Chamberlain argument shows that the standard objections in the literature to this argument miss the mark. So in particular, critics say, no, Nozick is just assuming from the start that people have strong libertarian property rights. So this entitles them to do whatever they want with their money and entitles Wilt to make as much money as he possibly can. In other words, they accuse Nozick of begging the question. Right. They say he's just assuming what he's trying to prove. He assumes libertarianism in his attempt to prove libertarianism. But this just isn't the case. And let me say a little bit about why. The most famous version of this objection comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel. He wrote a well-known reply in his review of Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And one of his main arguments was that Nozick mistakenly assumes that Chamberlain's fans have, quote, absolute entitlements to their property. So here again, he's accusing Nozick of assuming libertarianism from the start, or a libertarian conception of property rights from the start. So to quote Nagel, absolute entitlement to property is not what would be allocated to people under a partially egalitarian distribution. Possession would confer the kind of qualified entitlement that exists in a system under which taxes and other conditions are arranged to preserve certain features of the distribution while permitting choice, use, and exchange of property compatible with it. What somebody holds under such a system will not be his property in the unqualified sense of Nozick's system of entitlement. To suppose otherwise is to beg the question. So according to Nagel, the right to personal property doesn't confer a right to do anything you want with the property. Instead, it just confers a right to those uses that are compatible with the partially egalitarian distribution of property. And we offer a number of responses to this line of criticism in our paper. So first, it's important to recognize that Wilt's games will disrupt an egalitarian distribution, even if there are significant limits on the right of personal property. So to quote David Schmitz, a colleague of mine and a philosopher that Greg mentioned, Nozick neither argues nor presumes that people can do whatever they want with their property. Nozick's point is that if there is anything at all that people can do, even if the only thing they're free to do is to give a coin to an entertainer, then even that tiniest of liberties will, over time, disturb the pattern. So in other words, if one fan buys one ticket and everything else about the distribution remains unchanged, Chamberlain society will no longer be equal, and the pattern will be disrupted. So this means that Nozick's argument stands even if you adopt an extremely qualified sense of entitlement to personal property. Second, we argue that Thomas Nagel, Nozick's critic, and other liberal egalitarians apply a double standard when analyzing property rights and other liberal rights. We focus in particular on the liberal right to bodily autonomy. So here we take inspiration from one of Nozick's examples. So Nozick talks about the impermissibility of forced kidney redistribution to realize egalitarian patterns, and so we sort of run with that in defense of his view here. So imagine that the state decided to enforce a patterned principle of body part distribution. So the state says there must be an equal distribution of healthy kidneys. So Nagel, Rawls, and other liberals would probably reject this principle. They would say it's unjust because it violates a right of bodily autonomy. But notice that an advocate of forced kidney redistribution can make the very same argument that Nagel makes in response to Nozick. So here's how it could go. Suppose you have 2 healthy kidneys, and an agent for the kidney IRS shows up at your door, and the agent says, congratulations, you've been selected to donate one of your healthy kidneys to someone who has 0 kidneys. So we're equalizing. You have 2, this person has 0, and they will have 1 and 1. It's equal. You say, well, look, I appreciate this, but I am choosing not to donate, and this choice of mine is protected by my right of bodily autonomy. And then the kidney IRS agent's like, no. Like I've read Thomas Nagel. Like I know what I'm doing here. You actually don't have an absolute entitlement to your kidney. You only have a qualified entitlement to your kidneys. So you're only permitted to make choices about your kidneys that don't interfere with achieving an egalitarian distribution of kidneys. But of course, your choice not to transfer your kidney would interfere with the realization of an egalitarian distribution of kidneys. So it means you have 2 and this other person has 1. And so it's not a protected choice. Your choice to say no to the kidney IRS is not a protected choice. So the state can transfer your kidney without your permission. Now, not only does this seem sort of wrong and absurd, it also seems pretty clear that this kind of qualified right of bodily autonomy barely qualifies as a right at all. So if you say you're only entitled to make choices about your body within the limits imposed by egalitarianism, is basically a rejection of freedom of bodily autonomy. Now, what's critical here is that many liberals, including John Rawls, think that the right of personal property is on a moral par with the right of bodily autonomy. And since Rawlsian liberals reject patterned principles in the cases of body parts, we argue that they don't really have principled grounds for accepting patterned principles in the cases of property. If it's unacceptable in the body rights case, it's unacceptable in the personal property case. Now, I'm wondering, how much time do I have, given that we...
Yeah, you've got another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes? All right, I'll talk a little bit more. Okay. I came prepared. Philadelphia. Yeah. Philadelphia suburbs, basically. Yeah, I think. So now it does seem like there are differences between rights of personal property and rights of bodily autonomy, and so maybe these differences make patterning okay for body parts but not property rights. And we discuss a couple of differences, but we conclude that none of these differences actually justify any sort of moral asymmetry between the 2 rights. And I'll just talk about 2 of these arguments. So first, Rawls will say things that suggest that citizens are only entitled to an adequate amount of freedom. So maybe you have an adequate amount of freedom to choose your occupation. Maybe you have sort of adequate freedom to own and transfer property rather than the maximum amount. So the idea here would be, the state can restrict your liberty to use your property and choose your occupation as long as it leaves you with enough options, enough freedom, and so on. And so the intuition here is that it's okay to have restrictions if they leave you with an adequate amount of freedom, if you could still adequate amount of freedom to live a good life within those restrictions. So you might say Chamberlain's fans can still live a good life even if they can't spend an unlimited amount of money on basketball tickets, or if they can't see him play whenever they'd like, or if Wilt can't charge as much as you could still live a decent life within those constraints. If you can't see Wilt Chamberlain every day, some people might be able to live a decent life. Let's grant, for argument's sake. But the problem with this line of argument is it still doesn't establish that there's a moral asymmetry between body rights and property rights, because we can make similar arguments about body part redistribution. So consider that a person's right of bodily autonomy entitles them to say no to a bone marrow donation to a patient in need. So very few liberal egalitarians would endorse state-mandated bone marrow transfers as long as the bone marrow donors had an adequate amount of bone marrow left over. So they say, look, we're taking some of your bone marrow out without your consent. And you're like, well, no, but this violates my right of bodily autonomy. And they go, no. You still got enough bone marrow left over. like fair enough. But liberals would not buy that argument in the case of bone marrow. They don't buy the adequacy argument in the case of bodily rights. So it doesn't seem like they have a principled ground for endorsing it in the case of property rights either. The second argument I want to talk about just says that the net benefit of personal property regulation and redistribution is just a lot higher than that of body part regulation and redistribution. So the intuition here is like, it just seems reasonable to take some of a person's property when it's needed to save a life. Like you can take some of Wilt's property if we need it to finance redistribution, to keep people alive or provide necessary medical care. The benefit is a lot greater than the cost. So let's just tax some of Wilt's holdings to finance life-saving redistribution. We identify a couple of problems with this response. So first, liberals like Rawls think that basic liberties shouldn't have their protection depend on a cost-benefit analysis. So like I said earlier, even if it turned out that censoring speech was somehow beneficial on net, censoring speech would still not be justified, because freedom of speech is a basic liberty. It's just not subject to cost-benefit analysis. So here again, if we treat personal property as a basic liberty, which again liberals want to do, then it shouldn't be subject to cost-benefit analysis either. Secondly, and relatedly, it seems like violations of bodily autonomy can increase social welfare on net. So imagine that a country is facing a blood shortage that threatens the lives of a number of its citizens. In this case, you could imagine that coerced blood draws could save lives and promote social welfare. But here again, liberals of a Rawlsian sort would reject compelled body part redistribution. Say, yeah, maybe it is beneficial on net, but that still isn't enough to justify the violation of rights. So the basic point here is we think that this criticism that Nagel lodges against Nozick, that he's begging the question by assuming libertarian property rights from the start, just misses the mark. I think the right way to read Nozick is he's saying, look, liberals, you have a bunch of basic liberties: freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religious practice, but also freedom of occupational choice and freedom of personal property. All I am asking that you do is that you hold freedom of personal property and freedom of occupational choice to the same standards as all of the other liberties. And this might not push you all the way to libertarianism, but it gets you a lot closer than people like Rawls are. So thanks very much for your time.
We are now inviting Dr. Robson back up to articulate for us his particular essay in this volume, which you have on your chair, where you will, I think, construe Nozick's argument in a way that he might not have anticipated, Christianizing Nozick.
Thank you. Much of what Professor Freiman just said is true, except Jordan was indeed better than Chamberlain. And since I'm up here, I think I get the last word, which means I win like Jordan did. So in my essay, I assess the philosophical contribution of Anarchy, State, and Utopia and its potential compatibility with much of Christian political thought. Many people hold, as I myself once did, that Christianity is a naive and narrow worldview, and its proponents at best good-hearted people trapped by ideology. Many think God doesn't exist. After all, the problem of evil is real, and the Holocaust happened. Others say Christianity is against science, and worse, the church, say the Catholic Church, other churches, have done terrible things. If to Christianize a thinker is to harmonize their thought with this ideology, then Robert Nozick would not want to be Christianized. Neither would you or I. But there's more to be said. Now, there's nothing unexpected in these sentiments, so substantive responses abound. Read Viktor Frankl, for example, on God during the Holocaust. Read Stephen Barr on contemporary physics and the faith. Modern science began with and still presupposes the distinctively Judeo-Christian idea that the universe is fundamentally intelligible. This was an achievement in human civilization when people began to think that the universe itself, in principle, can be fully understood, or at least deeply understood, by the natural scientific method. Members of human institutions also do persistently fail in despicable and saddening ways. Indeed, perhaps failures of the Catholic and other churches, or at least their members now or before, are not so much evidence of the naivete or falsity of the religion itself as its limits in a post-lapsarian or fallen world. Second, on Christianizing Nozick, there's much to be gained by exploring how parts of a major thinker's contributions can be supplemented and perhaps supplanted to some extent by a millennia-old tradition of scholarly thought and spiritual insight and practice. Think of Thomas Aquinas, for example, the saint theologian and philosopher, lived in the 13th century. He wrote 8 million words, or the equivalent of 1,000 articles in 49 years of life. Professor Freiman and I are in our 40s, so maybe we have a lot more work to do. It sets the bar pretty high. But I think there's a whole lot to be gained by asking, for example, what might Aquinas or Aristotle or David Hume or Elizabeth Anscombe say over a drink with Nozick? I think that's a powerful invitation to intellectual challenge and improvement. In this talk, I'll present a few key threads of Nozick's account and then explore how it could be supplemented by the contributions of Christian thinkers. First, Nozick has this to say about the implications of his argument in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. He says, our main conclusions about the state are that the minimal state, limited to the narrow functions of protection against force, theft, fraud, enforcement of contracts, and so on, is justified, that any more extensive state will violate persons' rights not to be forced to do certain things and is unjustified, and that the minimal state is inspiring as well as right. The last part there is pretty interesting to me. It's inspiring as well as right. Nozick argues that the state may not deploy violence to make people act for their own good or for the good of others. For example, extracting wealth by the threat of imprisonment or fine backed by the muzzle of a gun is not morally permissible. This is so even if extraction-based redistribution, says Nozick, would say help financially struggling people who really do need the help. Nozick's anti-redistributive view is obviously radical by today's standards, but what's the logic behind it? Well, he says that the term distributive justice is not a neutral one. Moreover, quoting Nozick, there's no central distribution, no person or group entitled to control all the resources, jointly deciding how they are to be doled out. In a free society, diverse persons control different resources, and new holdings or property arise out of the voluntary exchanges and actions of persons. Nozick schematizes his so-called entitlement theory of justice in holdings. So one, any person who acquires a holding justly is entitled to it. So if you acquire a holding or property justly, you are entitled to it. Two, any person who receives a holding by a just transfer, for example, a trade or a gift, is entitled to it. And then three, no one is entitled to any holdings except by repeated applications of 1 and 2. Now, this is something that might seem to be a fairly simple argument. It might even seem obviously true. But think about the most complex object in the known universe. Each one of us has one of these between our ears, the human brains. 2 to 3 pounds of gray matter. It has a tofu-like consistency, 85 to 100 billion neurons. And then think about our interactions in our lives in society. Human societies might be the most complex entities in the known universe, partly because they include staggeringly complex human arenas like financial markets, for example. Nozick, as I'll put it, claims to have discovered much of the normative DNA of a free society, a blueprint of how a society of mutually respectful, free, and equal adults would approach distributive justice. So I think that's a pretty remarkable achievement. Of course, though, Nozick knew that our world is not fully just. He says, not all actual situations are generated in accordance with the 2 principles of justice in holdings, the principle of justice in acquisition and the principle of justice in transfer. Some people, for example, steal from others or defraud them or enslave them, seizing their product and preventing them from living as they choose. Hence, he says, we need a 3rd principle. We need a principle of rectification or rectificatory justice. Now, in my contribution to the symposium, and it's a pleasure to discuss it with you here tonight, I say, suppose that Rawls, not Nozick, is right. Suppose that we, the unspecified we. Suppose the government must maintain a distribution. I think I heard somebody say government here in the front. Must maintain a distribution of material resources in the name of justice. How can we, the unspecified we, maintain this pattern of distribution? For Nozick, the state would need to interfere continually in people's lives. Any distribution, as Professor Freiman talked about a bit, at time, say, T1 can readily change into a different distribution at T2 and yet another at T3 and on and on. People will persistently trade, invest, gift, share, combine, destroy, separate, and otherwise alter distributions within the unimaginably complex set of crisscrossing networks that we call modern society. Maintaining a pattern of distributions, if even possible, would be objectionably intrusive. Hence Nozick's oft-mentioned dictum, liberty upsets patterns. Now, an objector might claim that annual income taxes, say for a Rawlsian redistributive scheme, would not necessitate constant interference. Perhaps we need only have an annual income tax to push outcomes in certain directions. The strength of this countermove will depend, of course, on how individuals, firms, and other groups anticipate and respond to taxes imposed for later redistribution. Adept social actors, well, they would game the system. They would and do avoid or minimize their tax burdens. Importantly, though, Nozick's argument needn't assume the constant interference claim. Nozick thinks that much as robbery is morally illicit, interference via non-consensual, violence-backed taxation is morally illicit, even when merely occasional. We don't say periodic robbery is fine because, after all, it's periodic, right? So let me turn now to exploring the interface of the just discussed Nozickian political philosophy and Christianity. For all of its obvious ingenuity, and perhaps each of us has been so gripped by Nozick's book that we simply couldn't put it down, Nozick's discussion of property rights, the state, and redistribution will leave some readers feeling like unsettled moviegoers, having enjoyed the popcorn feast but forgotten to look up at the show. What, after all, one might ask, is the purpose of property in a life well lived? What is the value of distribution and redistribution for persons qua persons? In focusing on procedural justice, have we put ourselves in danger of losing sight of how property relations contribute to or detract from people getting their due? I don't have a profound criticism of Nozick's work here, but I will say, for those of you who aren't philosophers, one way we pay homage to others is to engage their work and offer some criticism and supplementation. All right, so I'll provide an interpretive lens or guide for how Christianly sympathetic readers might approach Nozick on distributive justice. I'll certainly not presume that Christian answers should seem obviously true to every rational person. As I said, they certainly didn't to me for a pretty long time. The combinations of reasons on any matter of substantive dispute are numerous, and the potential paths of reasoning are highly varied. What are reasons? A reason for something is a consideration in favor of it or against an alternative view. Yeah. We have many different reasons. We combine different words into all sorts of different sentences to express propositions sententially. It's very complicated, and reasons can be combined in so many different ways that it's no surprise that we all have very, very different views. In any case, I think one should no more present a condescending religiosity than a condescending secularism. All right, Pope Leo XIII and many others have provided worked out accounts of property and how it enables human beings to achieve our purposes in life. This was Pope Leo XIII writing at the end of the 19th century. We have singular reasoning powers among the animals, including a remarkable capacity for abstract thought. We alone, we human beings, travel to the moon. We alone, unlike other smart animals, dolphins, pigs, chimpanzees, etc., we alone create and use the internet, AI, and more. We alone are made in the imago Dei, the image and likeness of God. And by our intellects, we alone among the animals are made for deep union with God. Our physical bodies evolve, but our souls, including our immaterial intellects, as Aristotle thought they are infused by God, whereas the very idea of other smart animals growing in union with God seems outright bizarre. It's widely accepted that we humans are built differently, constituted with special supercharged intellects and correspondingly sophisticated wills. On the Christian view, private property is an indispensable tool that enables humans to foster a life of increasing cognitive, volitional, and affective union with God. Now, as usual, Nozick asks just the right questions. He asks, here in virtue of precisely what characteristics of persons are their moral constraints on how they may treat each other or be treated. We also want to understand, he says, why these characteristics connect with these constraints. Nozick considers candidate characteristics such as free will, moral agency, and rationality. He adds that the moral constraints discussed in ASU evidently derive from personhood. That's pretty remarkable, derive from personhood, and specifically from the fact that a person is a being, he says, able to formulate long-term plans for its life and regulate and guide its life in accordance with some overall conception it chooses to accept. Nozick, in fact, and interesting, says that just one candidate, having a soul, is in his list of characteristics that may be sufficient to serve as a basis for the moral constraints of interpersonal treatment. It would have been interesting to hear more from Nozick on the soul then in connection with Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Now obviously everything that deserves to be in a book can't be put into a book. It's impossible to give a full account of everything in a work, and to my mind basically every word that's in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is pretty much just where it should be. It's a beautiful book. A fuller account, though, of just what human persons are and what we are doing here on Earth would help to fill out the account. For instance, are we human persons individual substances of a rational nature, as Aquinas says, following the philosopher Boethius? Are we on a distinctively human voyage from birth to an eternal life in union with God, the source of all goodness, in whose goodness we participate, as Aquinas, C.S. Lewis, and others have argued? Or are we more like clumps of atoms arranged human body-wise, resulting from a blind process of biological and social evolution, and somehow fully governed by the four fundamental forces of physics, despite rarely feeling like we are? That is, feeling entirely free to move and live autonomously. What, in any case, is the answer to Nozick's question of what grounds our moral rights? If being ensouled fits into the answer, how does it? Now let me explore in my remaining time a few other themes that I think are rather important in Anarchy, State, and Utopia, and themes that I think align in interesting ways with Christian thought. First, there's the principle of subsidiarity, which is a staple of Catholic social thought. So suppose, for instance, that Nozick is right that any state beyond the minimal state would violate our rights. Christianizing Nozickian thought, one might say here that such a state would violate the Catholic principle of subsidiarity, according to which state activity should occur at the lowest feasible level. The word feasible is important there, by the way. With federal or supranational governments not doing work that state, provincial, or municipal governments can do at least as well. Alternatively, a Christianizer of Nozickian thought could argue an account of the needs of human beings in accordance with our nature might suffice to ground arguments for redistribution in order to meet basic human needs. So that's one issue, subsidiarity. Here's a second issue, the Christian idea that we're made in the image and likeness of God. For a long time, I didn't know what that meant, by the way. I thought it seemed like an unusual phrase, maybe an accidental kind of slippage of the tongue or some such. But I think there's a lot to be said on its behalf. So suppose, compatibly with Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that a non-minimal state would fail adequately to respect our dignity as free beings made, let's say, in the image of God, the imago Dei. On this assumption, one could elaborate on Nozick's argumentation by showing why an overstepping state is a threat to human flourishing, understood in the profound and beautiful way distinctive of the Christian faith. In the encyclical Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII, he's trying to chart a course between traditional views of socialism and capitalism. He argued that freedom to own private property and enter into relevant contracts matters because freedom to make life plans that perfect or complete one's rational nature matters. On a version of Nozickian Christianity, perfecting one's human nature ultimately matters only because growing in union with God matters. Right. Private property is but a tool, if an important one, a very important one, for living a good life for God. A defense of private property then becomes but one part of a broader social account of how human beings can live, how we are called by God to live. In the interest of time, I turn to a final issue, and perhaps the best place to resist Nozick's account, namely the issue of the rectification of past injustices. If Nozick's entitlement theory of justice and holdings is true, We want it to be a political philosophy for us as we are, for our political history as it actually unfolds. Now, for this, we'd want a detailed account of whether, how, and for whom rectification is required by justice. This is one place where a lot of scholars put pressure on Nozick's account, namely the entitlement account of justice and holdings. But there's a lot to be said. So it's one thing to reject a principle of justice. It's another thing to say that the details aren't worked out adequately. It helps to know the details to know whether the principle itself, whether it itself is true. Okay? But the complaint typically is more about the details, not about the principle. So here the Christian Nozickian would quite possibly insist that rectification for past injustices should include reallocation of existing distributions, which is not to deny, of course, public choice concerns such as the danger of rent seeking under the guise of rectification. A Christianized Nozickian might also emphasize that even or especially after grave injustice, the grace of God is what ultimately leads to true peace by rectification and reconciliation. It might be a both and. So there might be rectification that involves redistributing property to some extent. For example, victims of slavery might have a just entitlement to the redistribution of property. I think Nozick would be entirely on board with that. And then we can add the grace piece to that as well. In Miracles Today, Craig Keener, this is a book in 2021, reports that many miracle accounts enjoy strong evidential support and have, for instance, led to the conversions of countless skeptical atheists who had no other viable explanatory option. Notably, by the way, if just one miracle has occurred, and in Keener's book, he has a 300-page summary, which is one book that's really a summary of his 1,248-page book on miracles today. If just one miracle has occurred, then God exists. Okay, if God works then in our lives, then a full account of rectification for injustices would consider the promise and beauty of divine action in bringing together victim and perpetrator, human person and human person. God's grace can restore perpetrator-victim relationships to person-person relationships. So in Amazing Grace, the adult convert, John Newton, tells precisely this story as a former slave trafficker. He says, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." In conclusion, to Christianize Nozick would thus be, among other things, to indicate how a deep love for God can change and transform both individual lives and communities within a polity, and to work out the distinctively Christian commitments of that love for God. We all fail in virtue. We all will persistently fall short in this lifetime, and yet God's grace coupled with our own commitment can help a polity not only better secure justice, but also build a world more reflective of God's calling. Thank you.
We are going to enjoy a period now of some conversation. You're going to be included in a moment. But first, I've decided to ask our friends here, Dr. Freiman and Dr. Robson, to join in a conversation with Phillip Magness, Dr. Phillip Magness, who is the David J. Thoreau Chair in Political Economy here at Independent Institute. Let me tell you a little bit about him quickly. He's not going to give a speech, but he'll probably participate in the conversation if I know him. Phil Magness has served as a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and as academic program director for the Institute for Humane Studies, also adjunct assistant professor public policy at George Mason University. So I'm going to just toss a comment to the three of you first, and maybe I'll ask Phil to react, and then we'll get our friends. All right. My comment is this. We live in an era where the rhetoric and concept of social justice are everywhere in higher ed, media, popular culture, and half or maybe more than half of our political class. Social justice seems to be everything. What would Robert Nozick's thinking about issues of redistribution tell us about how to deal with what's called social justice in our day? In particular, maybe it was the case that Robert Nozick was lucky in his enemies. I mean, he could hold Nagel and Rawls to account for not being consistent with their liberal principles. But what if an advocate of social justice is not rooted in liberal principles, which seems to be the case today? So does Nozick help us deal with the onslaught of social justice advocacy? What do you think, Phil?
I can start us off here. There's interesting commentary in Anarchy, State, and Utopia that I was first introduced to in graduate school. And I'll give a little background on that. I had a professor that showed me John Rawls's theory of justice. I was studying the formation of the first tax system in the United States, the Constitutional Convention, and of course, you should go read John Rawls. Here's at least a thought experiment parallel to the Constitutional Convention. How do we settle upon this just tax system? Apparently, the answer was tariffs that actually came out of the Constitutional Convention. I think there might be one politician today that likes that, but it's a very strange result. And it never quite clicked in my mind how, after reading Rawls's assessment, where he's very favorable to certain types of redistribution, how that fit with the constitutional mechanism that we have, or whether thought experiment or actual realized implementation, we get to that. And then I noticed my professor that eventually became my graduate advisor saw me carrying around the Rawls book, and he was like, "Why are you reading that thing? Go read this instead." And it was Anarchy, State, and Utopia. And Nozick has an interesting comment in there. He likens taxation to coerced labor, likens it to labor that is extracted by force. And then some of the parallels that have been made suggest that this is similar to slavery in some respects. I'm not going to try to extract the moral meaning of that. That's a whole separate discussion. But what I do think is interesting here is Nozick recognizes the tension between the mechanism of taxation that occurs in any state, any government in human history. It's what's the old Benjamin Franklin, the certainties in life are death and taxes. It's something that's a given in any state that ever exists. And yet here's Nozick is also working through philosophically, basically settles on a justification for a minimalist state that does require some form of taxation to basically operate, which again was the Founding Fathers' great conundrum. They were trying to figure out how to fund the federal government of the United States at its original founding, when states themselves were not volunteering up money to the federal government to repay Revolutionary War debts. So there's a free rider problem, I think, that's also implicit there. But what does that tell us about social justice in the present day? I think, unfortunately, a lot of the philosophical discourse has become unhinged from the grounding that someone like Nozick would place it in, of recognizing here's this paradox, here's this conundrum of coerced labor, which is unjust for a number of reasons, but also necessity for the existence of the state to fund itself. How do we reconcile those two together? Now we have an unchained acceptances of taxation as a matter of propriety, and not only propriety, but propriety for as an end unto itself to redistribute to what is seen as fair by very subjective standards as announced from above by the person that happens to hold the reins of power. I know that's a bit of a long answer, but hopefully it's something that we can have fruits of discussion from.
We're getting started. Okay, which of you wants to go next?
I can go.
Go ahead.
So it's a great question. I think my answer's maybe a little complicated. So my first thought made me think of, Greg's comment about Nozick's comment that the very term distributive justice has a kind of bias baked in, where economic justice is just assumed to be about distributing almost certainly in an egalitarian way. That's just taken for granted. And I do think one concern about social justice rhetoric is that it just bakes in a particular conception of justice from the start. So on college campuses, it's very interesting. You will have committees on justice, and there will be no political philosophers or ethicists, yes, people who study justice on this. I think that's kind of a strange omission. And I think one reason for the omission is there's a presumption that we already know what justice is. And it's this particular egalitarian redistributive conception of justice. But I do think there's a complication here. And so maybe this is my olive branch to the social justice committees, which is I think there are what they would call forms of social injustice that Nozick or a Nozickian would agree are also forms of social injustice. So let me give you a particular, this I guess is like a thought experiment of sorts. So suppose you have someone who is unjustly incarcerated. So that, it doesn't matter how, maybe the cops plant fingerprints or the jury just gets it wrong or there was faulty DNA testing or something, but the person should not belong in jail and they end up in jail and they've been there for 10 years. You might say, all right, when they get out, they are owed some rectification. They are owed something for that deprivation of their liberty that they shouldn't have suffered. This is, of course, a very complicated topic, but this seems intuitive to me. Now you say, okay, what about other forms of unjust deprivation of liberty? So Nozick would, of course, say, if you are incarcerated for using or buying, selling drugs, that's an unjust deprivation of your liberty. So it's not like a factual injustice in the sense that people thought you were guilty of doing something or not. It's more like a moral injustice. So maybe, in fact, you were selling drugs, like that's true as a factual matter, but that's just not the sort of thing that you should be deprived of your liberty for. So suppose you're in prison for that for 10 years, and then you're released. It seems like you are owed some form of compensation for that. And so there's all sorts of interesting evidence, too, about sort of inequality and poverty that comes about as a result of incarceration. And so I think a Nozickian can say, look, I'm not doing the sort of patterned principle of justice that I was talking about earlier, where we say, oh, we look at what person A has and what person B has, and there's this big gap, and from this we can infer that there's an injustice. That's not really what we would be doing. We'd be saying, well, why is this person B in poverty? Or why does this person B have so much less than person A? And it's not because person A is Wilt Chamberlain and person B gave them all their money. It's that person B was unjustly deprived of their liberty. Right. And like I said, that seems like it calls for some form of compensation. And so, I don't know to what extent contemporary social justice concerns are about that in particular, but I do think some of them are. And if they're not, I think this is maybe an opportunity to have a conversation across the political aisle, and maybe we can find some common ground.
Here's a way of reformulating it, which I'm going to toss first at Greg Robson. So putting on a persona, so I'm a social justice warrior. And so I'm not really all that interested about balancing liberty and equality. I just want equality. And so this Nozick guy, he presupposes that liberty is some kind of good thing you have to worry about. I don't care about liberty. Why should I care about liberty? I just want equality. That's social justice. Do you have anything to offer to me as a social justice warrior?
So one question is whether you're saying it or thinking it makes it so. So yes. If a social justice warrior makes a claim, presumably there's a mind-independent truth about whether the claim itself is correct.
It feels true to me.
If it feels true to you, you might think what's true for you is true for you, what's true for me is true for me. We certainly don't think that about mathematics. We don't think that in the natural sciences. I don't think we think that either about lives well lived. A whole lot's going to depend, by the way, on what the modifier social is doing in the term social justice. What's the contrast class? What makes social justice different from other kinds or species of justice? Suppose you think social justice just is distributive justice. If that's what you think, then a Nozickian could say that to the social justice warrior or what have you, that Nozick himself has come up with a very sophisticated, very subtle blueprint for what a just society would be like. And a just society where social justice obtains is a society that respects the entitlement theory of holdings.
So, but this Nozick guy, I mean, he thinks that individual persons have liberty and that really matters. So why should I care about liberty? I think you have something to say about that.
Yes, well, a society without liberty, just look at the history of societies without liberty. A lot of societies, and in the 20th century, secular societies that would make the religious persecutions in past centuries look like patty cake. They didn't care much about individual liberty. They didn't find a special dignity in the human person. And Nozick certainly, for his part, thinks that You know, autonomy really does matter, for example, as a form of liberty. Autonomy is from the Greek autonomos, meaning self-ruling or self-legislating. And you might think, yes, equality matters a great deal, but it's being equal in a world where people aren't free to live the way they see themselves fit to live. That's not really freedom at all. That's not, in a sense, a society. One might say it's not a society worth having, or if there is such a society, it's worth improving it.
Nozick perceives a special dignity in the human person. That's a very interesting point. I'll just let that lie there. We're going to go to the audience in just a minute, but first, Dr. Phil Magness, do you want to ask any other question of our two colleagues before we turn to our friends?
Oh, wow. Yeah, just, I guess in terms of expertise on Nozick, and I can relate it back to the question Graham just asked, the notion of intensity of preference for social justice. How does one weigh that against an intensity of preference for liberty? And what if that intensity of preference is unlimited? What if great utility is derived from an intensity of preference for liberty?
On this, briefly, so even in Rawls has a lexical ordering of principles of justice, and he says that there are basic liberties, and these are more important than distributive concerns. We need to have the basic liberties first. We don't sacrifice the liberties for a just distribution, and certainly I think Nozick thinks the same. Remarkably, though, Rawls doesn't include, at least on my reading, the economic liberties that Nozick recognizes. So Nozick thinks, look, being able to make contracts, to make agreements, that's a fundamental part of what it is to lead a good life, to make agreements with people and associate freely with people. And Rawls doesn't include that. So that's something I think important that's in Nozick but not in Rawls.
Take another shot, Phil.
Well, I guess to relate that and pursue even further in the economic direction, there's a great debate that plays out philosophically in conceptualizations of economics and distribution, and that is the marketplace a democratizing phenomenon in itself? Is the consumer the sovereign actor and therefore the ultimate democrat, small d democrat, in exercising his or her individual rights and preferences to engage in free and voluntary exchange? Or is the market itself an agent of power, an agent of distribution in the service of some at the expense of others, which is very much the Marxian direction of this? How do we reconcile those two, and what insights can Nozick tell us on that?
Comment, Chris, before we turn to our friends.
Sure. I do think the market is a democratizing phenomenon in a number of ways. So, I mean, I guess on the consumption side, this is, I guess, sort of a fairly standard libertarian or classical liberal talking point. But my material standard of living is higher than John Rockefeller's was. Like, I have access to jet planes and medical treatments, and I don't know if he had air conditioning. I have Spotify. I have Netflix. He didn't have any of this stuff. It's incredible. And that was, 100 years that brought us to this. I think another interesting sort of underappreciated dimension of the democratizing capacity of the market is that it makes creative opportunities available to people. So, it gives you a lot of free time. So we have labor-saving devices. The length of the work week is getting shorter. The number of hours people are working. People are making movies on their iPhones now. Like, you don't have to be Steven Spielberg to make a movie. It's like, I don't know what the quality of these movies. I don't know. Well, anybody can make music, and then they can put it on Spotify, and people can listen to it. And so I do think that the market is democratizing, not just as consumers, but as creators. Like, you can post on social media. You don't have to be in the New York Times editorial board. You can post on social media. You won't have the same reach, but you're still sort of doing that thing that they're doing. And you can do it with this little device that's in your hand. I think that's actually pretty extraordinary.
We can take another 20 minutes for some questions from you. My colleague Matthew is in the back. Do you have the mic? Oh, you've got the mic is right there. It's going to be in Matthew's hand or Paul's hand. Yeah, we can hear it.
Testing.
Okay, since you're in the back, somebody in the back first, if you have a question, raise your hand, and my colleague Matthew will bring you the mic. Anybody toward the back have a question? There you go, Matthew.
Thank you. I'm really kind of new to this, and I'm just kind of curious. I wanted to ask about like the monopoly of, I guess, talent itself. And sometimes, like, if you give people the freedom to have occupations to everything, to some extent, I'm just going to entertain the Chamberlain argument. And for example, Chamberlain himself is
Could
a
you
very
hold the mic right to your mouth?
okay. Chamberlain himself is a very talented person, and himself is more fortunate than other people who would, even with a lot of practices and other types of, I guess, trainings, cannot actually achieve his goals or his achievements as a whole. So I was kind of curious what Nozick, in a Nozickian kind of perspective, would see these kind of inequalities within occupations based on the innate traits of or innate talents of individuals, and how he would kind of try to achieve some kind of equality or have that as a basic right.
So talent inequality. Okay, Matthew will gather up the microphone, gentlemen.
Yeah, so it's, I think, a really good question, the question about the distribution of natural talents and how it can seem fairly arbitrary. Some people are born with a very high IQ or a lot of physical strength or speed or what have you, or they're very good at a certain skill. It seems unfair. It seems perhaps due to the accident of birth that they have these advantages. Then we can ask, is that an injustice? Well, it depends on a lot of things. One thing it depends on, a Nozickian can say, is whether someone was treated inappropriately in the process of acquiring their natural talents. If it's just birth luck, it's not clear that one can point to anybody and say, like, you did this injustice, therefore compensation is owed. It's just an unfortunate fact of human life, but that doesn't at all mean that we shouldn't attend to inequalities like that, to do our best to help improve people's lives. We're not all born like Wilt Chamberlain was, where I assume a lot of his success is because he's naturally a great athlete, which I'll grant you that, okay? He also worked very hard, but that's as far as I'll go, okay? But yeah, so we can both say that there's a duty to help people, or at least it's very good to help people who have talent inequality, and say that there's not necessarily an injustice involved.
And so Nozick also would argue that you can be entitled to something even if it's due to luck. So just to return to the kidney example, so a lot of a person's health has to do with luck. And so you might be lucky to have 2 healthy kidneys, but that doesn't mean you're not entitled to those kidneys. Or you could imagine a coworker giving you like a lottery scratch-off ticket as a gift, and it wins. Make tons of money based on luck. You're still entitled to it. I have to say, though, this like reminds me of maybe my favorite passage from Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So Nozick is sort of talking about this worry that your talents are in some part due to luck. Yeah. And he says, but like people tend to be worried about this on like the labor market, where you have Wilt Chamberlain, who's 7 feet tall. He didn't earn that. He just got lucky. And he makes all this money, and he's got the success, and he's richer than everybody else, and people are really worried about that. But he's like, that's not the only place where like luck-based inequalities can give people advantages. So he's like, think about the dating and the marriage market. He's like, look, if somebody loves me because I'm like very good looking and funny, like, yeah, that gives me advantages that other people don't have. But that's not an injustice, or at least it's not the sort of injustice that we think the state has any business getting involved in. So I think he's certainly aware of this issue, but he says that there's a big jump between saying this person acquired this talent or something that gives them advantages and it's due to luck, and saying it's the state's business to get in there and try to rectify that.
We have a question in the front row, Matthew.
Well, since we live in a realpolitik world, I wanted to ask you a Marxian dialectic question. I want to play the devil's advocate, which is interesting since Marx, of course, was an atheist. And that is to suggest that at least one political party in the United States, certainly a whole bunch of other people, would argue that the ends justify the means, and that we should have equality. And the equality is not just an equality of one group, the rulers on the top, suppressing those poor, starving serfs on the bottom, but we have all of these other groups of victimhoods who have a legitimate complaint, and it's the duty of the Marxian society to fix that problem in the utilitarian world. So, gosh, that seems to be the truth. How can you argue against it?
So to look to historical examples, including in recent memory, of all these societies that have claimed to pursue the goal of greater equality through a Marxian system. Is there a single one that has not ended in mass immiseration, death camps, genocide, starvation, famines? But they're all equal, all equal in absolute misery. And I'd say even on top of that, look at measured inequality in places like the Soviet Union or in Venezuela today. Who are the most unequal members of society? They're members of the political caste. They're Nicolas Maduro, his family, his friends, his cronies that were given ownership of state industries, while everyone else is starving to put together scraps of worthless paper so they can get bread at the grocery store, if it happens to be in stock that day.
But I would argue that these are flawed examples, and we just need a pure example, and we will get it right. Why are you so intolerant?
Okay, we have a question also in the front here. I'm watching you in the back. You may have questions too. I've got my eyes out, so just let me know.
Yeah, so I want to posit an answer to. All right, I want to posit an answer to your supposition that you have a person whose highest value is, equal distribution, and how you would answer them. And I think there is really only two modes of human interaction. One is voluntary exchange, where two people interact and both think they're better off, and they do it voluntarily. And the other is forced interactions in which you impose your view of value on someone else. And if a person says the highest value is equal outcomes, right, then I think what you do is you force them to ask how that happens, because in the natural course of events, human beings are going to interact in order to improve their perceived position, and that's going to result in this inequality that you raised. Whereas, and if you ask how are you going to achieve equality, you're going to have to impose force on everybody in the society. And are you willing, as the person thinking this is the highest value, to pick up a gun and force you to give back the value that you gained by this voluntary exchange? And I think you force a person into a corner of saying, yes, I think that violence in every interaction in order to force my equality is the right choice to make. And I think that's how you approach it. You make them into a corner where they have to adopt violence as the organizing principle of society. So just that's my response to your...
Thank you. That's Matthew, you can take that back. We have another question from the gentleman in the baseball cap there on the aisle.
You were talking briefly about an adequate amount of freedom or an adequate amount of anything, in which whenever anybody says that, it makes my skin crawl a little bit, because the obvious question is, who gets to decide what's adequate?
Yep. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, right. There's a question in the back, gentleman in the blue blazer. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Hi, my name's Sam. Thank you very much for the talk today. I'm actually working on a chapter on Professor Robert Nozick right now, and I'm mostly focusing on his late Nozickian ethical thought, which connects back to his theory of the minimal state. And I guess this is more like a quick comment than a question, but I think a lot of critiques against the ASU can come from his late Nozickian theory, where he has this notion of ethical evolution that human beings go through when they continuously engage in voluntary interaction amongst people that is not directly coerced, but actually genuinely voluntarily induced. And I guess the question of whether I should refuse to give away my kidney to other people can be solved when the repeated voluntary interaction amongst the people within the framework of the minimal state actually leads to a point where everyone is actually willing to sacrifice themselves for other people. So like Nozick has these various layers of ethics that people can actually evolve into if they continuously live in the minimal state. And I guess a lot of critiques can be answered, like when we study his later thoughts on Nozickian ethics, I think. So yeah, that's just what I thought. As a scholar of Nozick and his philosophy, I thought maybe we learn a lot from studying his later books, I think, also on top of the Anarchy, State, and Utopia.
Thank you. Matthew will take the mic back. Do you have a comment on, is the later Nozick better than the early Nozick?
I myself, I don't have a settled view on that, but I will say that the last third of Anarchy, State, and Utopia is a much neglected set of ideas that's really fascinating, where Nozick emphasizes the extent to which and ways in which people who have different forms of life and different kinds of community, they can learn a great deal from each other. So perhaps that line of thinking can apply to cases like the kidney case, where maybe one community has a market for kidneys, another doesn't, another has some kind of middle option, and on and on. Empirically, lessons can be learned about what justice would be like in kidney distribution.
I don't know. It's hard to say there. Anarchy, State, and Utopia for me it's a work of art, and it just holds a special place in my heart. It's, like a first love almost. So I can't say they're better, although I do think it's worth stating how admirable it is that Nozick changed his mind on things. Like, I don't want to criticize Rawls so much. Well, I guess maybe I do. But, he wrote Theory of Justice, Son of Theory of Justice, Bride of Theory of Justice. And it's like, all right, fair enough. That's, if that's what you want to do. Like, that's not what Nozick did. And he, like I said, he had views at a certain age that he no longer had later on in his life. And I hope that's how I am. When I like in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I hope I have different views. Maybe not entirely different views, but I hope I'd say, I look back at some things I wrote in my 30s and I'm like, I don't know about those things. Like, I was a 30-year-old, way back then. And like that I personally evolve in my philosophical views. And like I said, I just think that's an extremely admirable quality of Nozick's that not enough philosophers have.
So the only thing I'd add to that is you've given us an idea for a 2039 50th anniversary issue, another one on Nozick, so we can keep this conversation going.
For sure. I'm struck actually a little bit by the fact that nobody seemed to be willing to poke you, Greg Robson, on this Christianizing thing. I have a question, therefore, and you want to load onto it, please feel free. My question is, or my comment, maybe you can respond to it, is that we noticed before that Nozick does perceive a special dignity in the human person, which is why resort to violence is impermissible, and there's something inviolable about that. You told us that maybe that's analogous to the Imago Dei. I would just point out that the Imago Dei is a Jewish concept way before it's a Christian concept. Any comment?
Yes. But notably, by the way, so if the idea of being made in the image and likeness of God is something that confers a special dignity on persons, where the thought is something like, look, unlike everything else in the entire cosmos that we know of, and I say to my students, look out the window. If you look out the window, you see a tree and grass and a human person and a car and on and on. Like, immediately the idea of a human person should leap out to you. This is something that's the inheritance of Judeo-Christianity. Of course, in Christian thought, the thought is that Christianity is a completion of Judaism in a very important sense. Christ on the cross lived 30 years, 3 years of ministry, 3-hour excruciating crucifixion, rose three days later. in glory. And so I think it's certainly important to acknowledge the roots and ongoing importance of the Imago Dei as a concept throughout many cultures in Judeo-Christianity and beyond. But I think that's something that's it's fertile ground for scholars to investigate as they think about the project potentially of rendering Anarchy, State, and Utopia compatible with a lot of explicitly Christian political philosophy.
The great American theologian Thomas Jefferson said that the God who gave us life gave us liberty. Seems like that's in the mode of your thought. But I do like the idea that there's something so special about individual human persons that to violate their liberty is really, really problematic. There's something appealing and protective about that. And I think Robert Nozick helps us to explore that idea from different angles. I've noticed in our conversation that we've benefited from Robert Nozick's form of thinking. We've also benefited from Robert Nozick's personal example, which is influencing generations of scholars, he has philosophical grandchildren, apparently, and he has literal grandchildren, I think, I've learned from Emily. And his personal example was beautifully illustrated to us by Emily Nozick at the beginning of this, which I loved hearing about. For all of this, I'm grateful to Robert Nozick, to his family, to those who have dedicated their life to analyzing his work and perpetuating his influence. And I'm grateful to all of you for coming tonight to the Independent Institute. Have a great evening.